I stood there frozen, the coffee pot still tilting in my hand as the dark stream bled past the rim of the cup and into the saucer. The inn smelled of cinnamon scones and fresh pine, but their voices cut sharper than knives. She won't last long, sell it fast. My late husband's nephew chuckled. My daughter-in-law laughed softly, already moving on. Sell. After 15 years of rebuilding these walls, after pouring every dime of my widowhood into this inn, after surviving the silence Frank left behind, I was already written off as a woman waiting to die. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. The whisper slid in under the hum of the espresso machine. She won't last long. Sell it fast. Margaret didn't look up. Her hand froze mid-pour, a stream of dark roast trembling as it missed the rim of the cup and bled into the saucer. The voice, Jessica's, had come from just around the corner, low and sharp like a paper cut. Cheryl's soft laugh followed, the sound of someone who'd already moved on. Margaret stood behind the coffee bar of the small Vermont inn she'd rebuilt from the bones up, a place she'd poured her entire widowhood into. Mornings were supposed to be quiet, muffins warming in the oven, wood floors creaking with familiar weight, and the piney hush of mountain air drifting through cracked windows. But this morning, the silence felt rigged. She eased the cup onto a tray, wiped the spill with a practiced hand, and leaned toward the half-closed office door. Inside, Jessica stood with her back to Margaret, tall, polished, every hair in place as always. She was pointing at a glossy folder spread across the desk. Cheryl stood next to her, arms folded, lips pursed. Kyle, her late husband's nephew, lounged on the edge of the desk like he owned the place, flipping through real estate brochures like he was picking vacation rentals. "That one's already got a cash offer," Jessica said, tapping a page. Kyle grinned. "Damn. Place barely hit the market." "It's a hot area," Cheryl added, eyes flicking to the hallway. "They'll snap it up before she's even—" She stopped. The three of them turned. Margaret stood in the doorway, holding the tray like a peace offering she hadn't meant to bring. Jessica's face didn't flicker. "Morning," she said brightly, brushing a strand of silvered hair behind her ear. "We were just discussing the marketing plan for fall bookings." Margaret nodded slowly. "That's so." Kyle slid off the desk and stretched. "Aunt Em, you should sit down sometime. You've been on your feet since sunrise." Margaret's smile didn't reach her eyes. "You all need coffee?" Jessica stepped forward. "You okay?" She hated that tone, calm, clinical, the same tone people used when checking if your mind was still intact. Like grief had cracked you open so wide, something might have fallen out. "I'm fine," Margaret said. "Just overheard something about selling fast. That about the maple jam?" Cheryl laughed, relieved. "We're out of the small jars. Kyle was saying they'd move quicker if we rebranded." Margaret held her gaze. "Right." She turned, tray balanced steady in her hands, and walked back to the kitchen. Only when the door swung shut behind her did the weight of the moment settle in her chest like wet snow. Ruth called 2 minutes later, right on time, her neighbor and oldest friend, sharp as ever despite arthritis in both knees. The ringtone was a Johnny Cash riff Margaret never changed. "You're quiet," Ruth said without greeting. Margaret exhaled into the receiver. "They think I'm already gone." The words were so quiet. She could barely hear herself say them. "You heard something." "I did." Ruth didn't ask what. She waited. Margaret lowered her voice. "Jessica and Kyle are planning to sell my inn before I've even finished grieving." A silence stretched between them, one that didn't need words. "You need to stay smart," Ruth said finally. "Smarter than them. You know how people act when money sniffs around grief." Margaret stared out the kitchen window. Morning mist curled through the trees like smoke from a dying fire. I rebuilt this place, Ruth. Every wall, every nail. After Frank died, it was the only thing that made sense. And now it's a threat to them, Ruth said. That means you're still powerful. Don't let them smell doubt. Margaret nodded slowly. The inn smelled like cinnamon scones and betrayal. Outside, she heard the crunch of tires on gravel, another SUV pulling into the driveway. Not a guest. Too early. She leaned toward the window and froze. A man stepped out. Slim, expensive coat, legal pad under his arm. She recognized the logo on his briefcase. Estate law. Her name hadn't even been cold on the paperwork yet. Margaret didn't open the front door when the lawyer rang the bell. Instead, she stood behind the lace curtain in the hallway, watching him shift his weight from one foot to the other, a faint irritation flickering across his well-moisturized face. He glanced at his phone, then tapped something on the screen. Probably a note about her being unavailable or uncooperative. She didn't care which. Let him wait. Let them all wait. Once his car rolled back down the gravel drive, tires kicking up dust like a dog shaking off fleas, Margaret moved fast. She stepped into the small side office off the laundry room. No one else ever used it. Jessica had mocked it once, called it that weird little bunker. But Margaret had never minded the tight walls or the drafty vent under the desk. It was hers, and it had a lock. She opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a thick manila envelope, its flap sealed with 2 rubber bands and decades of resolve. Her fingers trembled as she slid out the deed. Not because she feared what it would say, but because she already knew what it might. She remembered the conversation years ago. Jessica had sat at this very desk, younger then, fresh off her second divorce, and full of real estate ambitions. "It's smart planning," she'd said. "Joint ownership makes refinancing easier, and it protects the family if anything happens to you." Margaret, weary from probate battles over her late husband Frank's estate, had almost agreed. She'd even started the paperwork. But something, maybe Ruth's voice in her head or the bitter memory of watching vultures circle after Frank's funeral, had stopped her. She scanned the page now. There it was. Jessica Harland. Alternate grantee. Unfiled. The name sat like a watermark. Present, but powerless. Margaret felt her throat tighten. They'd counted on her for getting this. Maybe even hoped she'd die before noticing the detail. But it wasn't filed. The revision had never gone through county recording. She'd pulled back at the last minute, stuck to her gut like she always did when her instincts twitched. She flipped through the rest of the documents. Everything from the original purchase to the zoning approvals and small business licenses she'd fought for tooth and nail. Her name was on every signature line, not Jessica's, not Kyle's, not even Frank's. He'd passed before the closing. This place was hers. She slid the deed back into the envelope, more certain than ever that it had to stay that way. With a deep breath, Margaret reached for the landline. No texts, no voicemails, no record. This call needed to stay private. Victor Carmichael answered on the second ring. "Margaret, you all right?" The warmth in his voice nearly cracked her. Not pity, respect. The kind earned in the trenches of a small-town courtroom where he'd once stared down a greedy bank and saved her from foreclosure. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to be brutally honest. Always." Back in 2013, I drafted a revised deed with Jessica listed as a joint owner, but I never filed it. The original stayed active, correct? "You still have it?" he asked. "I'm looking at it." He paused, paper shuffling faintly on his end. "If it was never recorded with the county clerk," he said, "and the original remained unaltered, then legally, you have full control." Her knees almost buckled. She leaned against the desk. I knew she was circling, she said, voice low, but I didn't know how close she thought she'd gotten. You want me to do anything on my end? Not yet. She eyed the window. Kyle's car was still in the drive, half dusted with September pollen. They'd probably be sitting in the breakfast room now, sipping coffee like they'd earned it, making calls she'd never approved. No sudden moves, she said. But if they file anything without my signature, they'll hit a wall, Victor said. I'll make sure of it. She hung up, blood thrumming in her ears. Across the hall, she could hear footsteps, Jessica's measured heels moving toward the kitchen. Margaret slipped the deed into the bottom of a book in the built-in cabinet, behind a row of outdated guidebooks no one had touched in years. She closed the glass doors and turned just in time. Jessica stepped in without knocking. Hey, she said, too casual. Can we talk? Margaret smiled. Of course. She gestured to the breakfast table, calm as a pond in winter. Jessica sat down. There's something I think you should consider. I'm listening. Jessica reached into her bag and pulled out a stapled packet. Real estate comps, printouts, and a blank signature page. Margaret kept her hands in her lap. She didn't blink. She didn't need to. The diner smelled like burnt bacon and lemon-scented cleaner, familiar, harsh comforts that suited Margaret's mood. She slid into the booth across from Ruth, who was already halfway through her first cup of coffee and reading the classifieds like the world still worked in ink. Morning, Ruth muttered, not looking up. You look like hell. I feel worse, Margaret replied. Ruth folded the paper and leaned in. Talk. Margaret lowered her voice. She brought comps, put them on the table like she was selling a timeshare, didn't even blink. She thinks you're too soft to fight, Ruth said flatly. She's betting on your grief. And your manners. Margaret glanced around the diner, quiet at this hour. A trucker nursing his eggs at the counter. Waitress wiping down menus with tired hands. No Jessica. No Kyle. No one to overhear. She has a signature page already printed, Margaret said. Blank. Waiting. Ruth's jaw tensed. She picked up her mug and slammed it down with enough force to make the silverware jump. Then you know what to do, she snapped. Cut them out. No warning, no discussion, just cut. Margaret looked down at her hands. They were steady now. Strong. I started last night. Pulled the tax files, bank statements, even the old loan paperwork Frank took out before he died. I'm consolidating everything, tightening the net. Ruth gave a tight nod. About damn time. Margaret reached into her bag and slid a folded piece of paper across the table. Ruth opened it. A ledger page with 3 names circled in red ink. Jessica, Kyle, Cheryl. They're all connected to this, and they think I'm still asleep at the wheel. Ruth smirked. Let them. By the time she got back to the inn, the air had shifted. Sunlight had lost its warmth. It was that late September chill that slid in beneath sweaters and rattled window panes. Margaret moved with precision, room by room, gathering folders, passwords, backup keys, anything financial that could be locked or duplicated. In the study, she opened the old desk Frank had claimed but never used. Taped under the bottom drawer was the USB stick she'd hidden after the fire inspector found the faulty wiring. It held scanned copies of every upgrade, every expense, every renovation from the last 10 years. No one knew it existed. She made a new file name, Contingency Plan. While the documents uploaded, she grabbed her iPad and pulled up Jessica's Facebook page. Public, of course. Jessica had always been performative. There it was, just posted an hour ago. A filtered shot of a coffee in front of a laptop, sunlight bouncing off the screen. The caption, Big changes ahead, can't wait to reveal my next property project. Gar's new investment, Star's next chapter. Margaret stared at it, jaw tight. Next property, as if it were already hers. She clicked on Jessica's tagged photos. In one, Cheryl had commented, "So proud of you for taking the lead." Margaret took a screenshot. She took 10. She was still cataloging the digital trail when her phone buzzed, an unknown number. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. A voicemail popped up seconds later. She played it on speaker. "Hey, this is Derek from Hillcrest Golf Club. Just letting you know that Kyle's guest privileges have been extended through the fall, thanks to the pending sale he mentioned. Congrats on the move, and let us know when you'll be in town." Margaret stared at the phone, heat crawling up her neck. He was telling people she was selling, announcing it like a foregone conclusion, in clubs she wasn't even allowed into. The gall of it, the certainty. She stood up so fast the desk chair scraped against the hardwood. This wasn't grief anymore, it was war. But it would be quiet war. Not screaming, not threats. Paper, pixels, timing. They'd never hear the plan until it was too late. She returned to the USB. The file transfer was complete. She pocketed the drive, grabbed her coat, and stepped out into the wind. The air snapped sharp against her face. She welcomed it. By the time Jessica and Kyle found out what she'd done, it would be signed, sealed, and documented in 5 different places. None of them accessible to their smug, champagne-sipping fingers. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. Time to make one more call. Not Victor. Someone they didn't know about. The woman picked up on the first ring. A clipped voice. "This is Naomi?" Margaret smiled. "You still do asset shielding?" Victor's office hadn't changed in 20 years. The same cracked leather chairs, the same brass lamp leaning slightly to the left, and the same ticking clock on the far wall that sounded louder in moments like this. Margaret sat with her coat still on, palms resting on the thick oak table, eyes steady as Victor slid the folder across to her. "This is the cleanest version I could draft," he said, adjusting his glasses. "No wiggle room, no ambiguities." He flipped the folder open, revealing a set of quitclaim documents, the legal font sharp and final. His voice dropped into the slow cadence he used only when stakes were real. "You're revoking any implied interest Jessica might have had, past or present. This voids the unfiled revision permanently. It also creates a formal firewall around the current deed, reinforcing sole ownership." Margaret nodded once. "Walk me through it, every word." He did, clause by clause, sentence by sentence. Not because she didn't understand. Margaret had a sharper legal mind than most of the men who'd ever tried to manage her, but because this had to be airtight. Bulletproof, Ruth-proof, Naomi-proof, Jessica-proof. Victor paused midway. "You sure you want to go this far?" "I passed Shore 2 funerals ago," she said. He didn't ask which ones. She picked up the pen, the weight of it cool in her hand, and pressed it to the first line. The silence between them was thick, broken only by the scratch of ink on paper. With each signature, Margaret felt something loosen in her chest, like she'd been holding her breath for 6 months and was finally allowed to exhale. At the last line, she paused. Victor waited. "I used to think family meant safety," she said softly. "That loyalty went both ways. And now? Now I know it's an equation. Control equals silence. They thought I'd be too paralyzed to fight back." She signed. Victor closed the folder with quiet finality. "I'll take this straight to the courthouse," he said. "You want to come with?" She stood. "I'm not missing a single step." The courthouse smelled like dust and authority. Margaret followed Victor down the echoing hallway, past plaques and framed portraits of judges who'd come and gone. His briefcase swung at his side, every step echoing like a gavel. At the end of the corridor, a clerk sat behind a fingerprint-smudged window, chewing gum and flipping through a romance paperback. She glanced up, saw Victor, and straightened. "Morning, Mr. Carmichael." He nodded. "I need these recorded immediately." The clerk took the file, eyes scanning the header. Quitclaim. Full revocation. One property listed? Yes, Victor said. No counterparty acknowledgement needed. Original grantor has full possession. We're reinforcing. The clerk stood, walked to the back room. Margaret stared at the metal stamp machine on the desk, its dull red handle worn smooth from years of use. It reminded her of a meat grinder her grandmother used to own. Practical, unforgiving. The woman returned, holding a single stamped page. Filed and sealed, she said. Time-stamped, 11:32 a.m., September 22nd. Victor accepted the copy and handed it to Margaret. She didn't just look at the seal. She felt it, deep in her spine. There was no going back now. Outside, the courthouse steps were slick with fallen leaves. She paused at the top, the wind catching her scarf. The paper still in her hands. Do I need to worry about them contesting it? She asked quietly. Victor hesitated. They can try, but without any legal standing, it's posturing. No court will touch it. She nodded, slowly folding the paper. It's done, she said. It's done. But her eyes were on the parking lot, narrowing. Across the street, leaning against a car too new for local plates, stood Kyle, phone in hand, watching them. He didn't wave, didn't smile, just lifted his phone and tapped something, then slid back into the driver's seat. The engine started. Victor turned. You know he saw us. I'm counting on it, Margaret murmured. And she smiled, not with triumph, but with precision. The listing went live at 7:14 a.m. Cheryl didn't even bother to use a pseudonym. The post sat there on Zillow's front page like a landmine. Rustic 12-room country inn, turnkey business opportunity, motivated seller. Underneath, a gallery of carefully filtered photos. Dining rooms staged with fake tulips. Rooms shot from angles that made them look larger. A few exterior shots lit in early morning sun, so the shingles looked newer than they were. Margaret stared at the screen from her kitchen table, the glow of her iPad reflecting in her coffee. The account name was hers, but the post clearly wasn't. A ghost listing, fake login, false authority, familiar fingerprints. She tapped the contact number. Cheryl's voice greeted her on the outgoing message. Hi, you've reached Cheryl Adams with Harlan Property Solutions. Leave your name and we'll be in touch soon with availability. The gall. The assumption. Margaret didn't leave a message. She didn't need to. They had just fired their opening shot in a battle they thought they'd already won. By 9 a.m., the neighbors were circling like cats in sunbeams. Margaret caught the first one, Mrs. Linton from 3 doors down, outside her garden gate, holding a bag of store-bought muffins and a rehearsed smile. Heard the place is finally going. What a relief, huh? Must be bittersweet. Margaret held the gate open. Bittersweet? Oh, you know, letting go after all those years. Jessica said you were ready to simplify. Did she now? She's been so brave, Mrs. Linton added. Doing all this for you while you grieve? Margaret took the muffins, nodded, and said nothing. When the woman finally left, Margaret set the bag gently on the counter. She didn't open it. She didn't need to taste what betrayal baked into boxed batter felt like. By noon, Jessica was at the town co-op, waving to familiar faces like she'd just returned from war. She stood too close to people, laughed too loudly, kept using phrases like under contract and pending escrow and refreshing the property's vision. Margaret didn't see it herself. Ruth did. From her booth at the diner, coffee steaming in front of her, Ruth had full view of Jessica's performance. She's strutting around like she's hosting an HGTV pilot, Ruth muttered, stirring her creamer. You sure you want to let her keep embarrassing herself? Margaret sat across from her, serene in posture, hands wrapped around her cup like she was just warming them, not bracing herself. She's hanging herself with the rope she brought. she said softly. Ruth raised a brow. You sound almost religious. I'm not, Margaret replied. I'm practical. They sat in silence a while, letting the clink of plates and the hiss of the espresso machine fill the space. Margaret reached into her coat pocket, pulled out the now-stamped deed from the courthouse, unfolded it carefully. She didn't set it on the table, just glanced at the seal again. It gleamed faintly under the diner's harsh lights. This doesn't get shared, she said. Obviously, Ruth replied. Then, Margaret's phone buzzed. Victor. She answered with a calmness she didn't quite feel. It's finalized, he said, no preamble. The clerk confirmed recording, and I triple-checked the public record index. You're the only name on file. You're bulletproof now. Margaret didn't speak right away. A long breath pushed quietly out of her. She'd been holding that breath since April. Thank you, she said. You're welcome, Victor replied. You'll want to screenshot the property index, just in case they try to claim otherwise. I already did. I figured. She hung up and looked up at Ruth. It's mine. All of it. No gaps. Ruth smiled, but it was tight. And they're still out there flapping their jaws like they've already cashed the check. Let them flap. Margaret reached for her spoon and stirred slowly. From the corner of her eye, she noticed something. Jessica, still outside, had just received a phone call. Her entire expression shifted. Whatever she'd been told, it wasn't part of her plan. Jessica turned on her heel, heading for her car, yanking open the door like it owed her an apology. Ruth snorted. Looks like someone just got a wake-up call. Margaret sipped her coffee, expression unreadable. First tremor, she said. Then she reached for her bag, her phone, and the deed, folding it back into the same envelope Cheryl had once handed her 3 years ago during a family brunch, suggesting streamlining assets. Margaret slid out of the booth. Time to shift the fault line. Cheryl had dressed for control. Crisp blazer, sleek ponytail, that aggressive lipstick shade she reserved for closings and courtrooms. She stood behind the faux marble reception desk of her small real estate office, arranging manila folders and talking too loudly about serious investor interest to no one in particular. Jessica leaned against the wall near the coffee station, sipping from a branded paper cup like it was champagne. Kyle paced, phone in hand, wearing that smug, distracted expression he always wore when he thought someone else was handling the details. We'll need to remove the porch swing from the listing photos, Jessica said, flipping through a packet of comps. It makes the place look older than it is. Cheryl nodded quickly. Already flagged it for the photographer, and I boosted the Zillow exposure budget this morning. Kyle looked up. Any offers yet? Cheryl smiled. We're expecting a cash walk-in. Said they saw the place online and want to move fast. Good, Jessica said. Let's wrap this before October. Margaret's going to drag her feet if we give her time. The front door opened with a low chime. Margaret stepped inside. She didn't speak, didn't smile, didn't close the door behind her. She walked past the row of real estate flyers, past the motivational quote wall art, past Cheryl's carefully arranged stack of seller success stories. She reached the front desk and set down a single document. One paper. No folder. No extra padding. The courthouse seal was visible even from across the room. Cheryl's hand paused midair. Jessica's cup stopped halfway to her lips. Kyle turned fully toward her. Is that what I think it is? He said, already defensive. Margaret didn't answer. She simply tapped the top corner of the page with one gloved finger. That's the legal record, she said evenly. Filed, stamped, recorded under my name. Sole ownership. Cheryl stepped forward. Margaret, I think there's been a... No, Margaret cut in. No confusion, no mistake. She turned the document slightly, angling it toward Jessica. You pushed a listing on a property you don't own. You used my name, my photos, my address. That's more than presumptuous. It's fraudulent. Jessica's face lost all color. Margaret. Listen, this was all just prep work, she said quickly, trying to recover. We assumed you were going to sign. You said you were thinking it over. I said nothing, Margaret replied. I watched you. That's not the same as agreeing. Kyle moved beside Jessica now, scanning the deed like he was trying to find a typo that would make it all go away. That can't be real, he muttered. You never filed anything. Victor said there was an old version. Victor said nothing to you, Margaret said coldly. Because Victor doesn't answer to you. As if on cue, Cheryl's office phone rang. She flinched. It rang again. Jessica gave her a sharp look. Cheryl hesitated, then picked it up. Harlan Property Solutions, she said, voice a few notes higher than usual. A pause. Then her face shifted. Yes, I understand, she said slowly. No. Of course. We'll take it down right now. Another pause. Longer this time. Then, no, I wasn't aware it was recorded. I was misinformed. Jessica stepped closer, whispering urgently. What is it? Who's on the... Cheryl held up a hand. Yes, Mr. Carmichael. I understand. We'll cease all listings immediately. I'll call Zillow today. She hung up. Her hand hovered over the keyboard for a second, then dropped limply to her side. Margaret watched it all without blinking. The energy in the room had turned. They weren't predators anymore. They were children caught with stolen candy. I'd suggest you notify your photographer as well, Margaret said. There's no shoot scheduled. There never was. Jessica's voice broke through the silence, brittle and sharp. You don't get it, do you? You're sitting on a sinking business. You think you've won something, but all you've done is delay the inevitable. Margaret turned toward the door. At the threshold, she looked over her shoulder. Jessica, she said quietly, if the business ever sinks, it'll be because you drilled the holes. She walked out without waiting for a reply. Back in the office, Cheryl sat down hard in her chair, staring at the screen. Kyle's phone buzzed again. He ignored it. Jessica didn't move at all. Outside, Margaret reached her car and opened the door. Inside her coat pocket, her phone vibrated. A new number. New area code. She answered it anyway. A woman's voice. Low, professional. Naomi. Asset redirection's ready, she said. We're prepared to retitle the holding account under the shell. Just waiting on your go. Margaret looked up through the windshield, watching the reflection of the office windows. 3 silhouettes frozen behind the glass. She smiled faintly. Go, she said. The post went up at 6:42 a.m., barely enough time for the sun to break over the ridge. So excited for our next chapter. Big things ahead. Couldn't be more grateful. Fresh start. Stark, grateful heart. Hawk real estate journey. Jessica had chosen a photo of herself standing on the porch of the inn, chin tilted like a magazine cover. The caption oozed confidence, calculated warmth, just enough ambiguity to invite speculation. By 7:03, the comment section was already humming. Looks beautiful. Congrats. Is this the place on Maple Hill? Margaret L., are you finally selling the inn? So happy for you both. Margaret read the comments while the kettle whistled, steam curling into the beams of morning light spilling across the kitchen floor. She didn't answer. Not right away. Not in the way they expected. Instead, she scrolled slowly, screen glowing faintly beneath her thumb, and let the frenzy build. By 7:45, 5 people had tagged her. 2 of them had sent direct messages. One was from the woman who ran the Historical Society, asking if she could help with transition documentation. Another came from Kyle's fiancé, someone Margaret had barely spoken to in person, asking if the new buyer would be honoring existing staff agreements. Margaret turned the kettle off, poured her tea. She walked it to the sunroom without a word. She opened her Facebook app. Typed 2 words into the comments: watch and see. She didn't reply to anything else. Didn't clarify, didn't explain, didn't take the bait. Just left those 3 syllables hanging like a loose thread, daring someone to tug. She set her phone face down and went to check the oven. The sourdough was rising exactly the way Ruth liked it. Slow, dense, confident. When she arrived at Ruth's later that morning, the kitchen was already full of warm air and cinnamon. "You see it?" Ruth asked, apron dusted in flour, fingers deep in pie dough. Margaret slid her bag onto the bench. "She's still posting like nothing happened." Ruth snorted. "Denial's a hell of a drug. She's not ready to lose control of the narrative." She already did. Margaret leaned over and peeked into the oven. "Those smell better than they look," Ruth said. "That's what your son said about your second husband." Ruth cackled and wiped her hands on a dish towel. "God, I miss this version of you." Margaret didn't reply, but the corner of her mouth tugged. They moved around the kitchen like clock hands. No rush, no wasted motion. The inbox pinged just after noon. Victor's name in the subject line. No greeting, just the facts. Margaret. Final filings confirmed across both county and state databases. Asset redirection has posted. Cross-indexed under shell holding with limited visibility per Naomi's structure. No loopholes, no access, no claims possible. V. Margaret closed her laptop, pressing the lid shut like sealing a vault. "Everything's locked," she said quietly. Ruth nodded like she'd already known. "You ever wonder what they'll do once they realize they're shouting into a sealed room?" Ruth asked, voice light but eyes sharp. "They'll scream louder." "And when no one answers?" Margaret walked to the window, wiping her hands on a clean dish towel. She looked out over Ruth's back garden, dahlias still holding on to the season, bees slow with the chill. "Jessica doesn't know how to be irrelevant," she said finally. "Kyle doesn't know how to be broke." Ruth chuckled. "You just gave them both a crash course." Margaret smiled faintly. "The syllabus starts tomorrow." She turned from the window and picked up her phone again. More notifications, more tags. Someone had started a rumor in the comments that Margaret was in talks with a luxury brand. Another neighbor had posted a screenshot of the courthouse record, but it was incomplete, cropped, misread. Confusion was spreading faster than facts. And Margaret? She let it. Control didn't always mean correcting the record. Sometimes it meant letting people write the wrong version of the story, until the ending proved otherwise. She turned her phone off and slid it into her coat pocket. Jessica's narrative was a parade built on borrowed music, and Margaret had just stolen the drums. The knock came just past 4. 3 sharp raps. Too firm, too fast, too practiced to be friendly. Margaret didn't flinch. She had been expecting them since the first neighbor asked if she was going corporate. The sourdough sat cooling on the rack. The air still smelled like cardamom and old wood. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and walked calmly to the door. Through the lace pane she could see them both. Kyle, pacing like a caged animal. Jessica standing still, lips pressed tight. A manila folder clutched in one hand like a weapon. Her lipstick had smudged slightly. Kyle's jaw was tight with fury. Margaret unlocked the door with one deliberate twist and opened it halfway. Just enough. Jessica stepped forward. "We need to talk." I gathered. Kyle edged closer. "You've gone too far." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "Funny, I was about to say the same." Jessica pushed the folder forward like she was presenting evidence in a trial. "Sign it back." Margaret didn't reach for it. "What exactly do you believe I'm signing?" she asked. "You know what this is," Kyle snapped. This is the fix. You reverse the deed update, relist the inn properly, and we move forward. Like adults. A breeze lifted Jessica's hair slightly, but she didn't move. Margaret smiled. Cool. Thin. You've had months to behave like adults. You chose otherwise. Jessica's voice rose a notch. We were trying to preserve the family legacy. Frank wouldn't have. Frank's name isn't on the deed. Margaret cut in. Never was. Jessica's mouth opened, closed. Kyle stepped forward, boots scuffing the porch wood. You don't get to make this ugly. It doesn't have to be like this, but if you think this is over, you're wrong. Margaret's gaze didn't move from his. Do you know, she said slowly, what happens when people threaten a sole title holder on her own property? Kyle blinked. It gets real quiet, she added. Across the street, a screen door creaked open. Mrs. Linton stepped onto her porch with a watering can and a glance too casual to be coincidence. 2 houses down, someone stood behind a half-closed blind. It fluttered once. The town was small. Word traveled. Margaret didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Jessica shifted uncomfortably. You think you've won something. I've protected what's mine, Margaret said. There's a difference. A sedan pulled to the curb and idled. Neither Kyle nor Jessica noticed. Ruth sat behind the wheel, window cracked, phone angled slightly on the dash. The red recording light blinked, barely visible from the porch. Kyle's tone sharpened. You always played the victim. Now you're just being cruel. Margaret leaned on the edge of the door. Is it cruelty to close a door you never knocked on respectfully to begin with? Jessica exhaled, exasperated. You've made your point, but this affects more than you. We had buyers lined up. We had financing. You had fantasy, Margaret said. Now you have fallout. Jessica's voice turned low. This is going to backfire on you. Margaret nodded slowly, almost thoughtfully. Maybe. But if it does, it'll be on my terms. Not yours. Kyle shoved his hands into his coat pockets, stepped off the porch, and muttered something Margaret couldn't hear. Jessica stared at her for a long beat. Then, with a tightly controlled breath, she set the folder on the welcome mat like a failed offering. This isn't over. Margaret nodded once. I know. She shut the door. Not hard. Not soft. Just enough. Through the window, she watched them stand there for 3 seconds longer than they should have, then turn, defeated in different ways. Ruth's car didn't move. The red light kept blinking. Margaret turned from the door and walked back toward the kitchen. On the hallway side table, the deed still sat in its original envelope. Next to it, the phone. A text blinked in from Naomi. Asset shift complete. They'll find nothing. Margaret didn't reply. She just opened the oven again and pulled out a second loaf. Outside, Kyle kicked the mailbox. The lid snapped shut. Victor's voice came through the speaker like steel wrapped in calm. They can huff, puff, and send all the cease and desist letters they want. But they don't have standing, Margaret. No ownership, no contract, no leg to lean on. And believe me, Cheryl won't put her license on the line for their fantasy. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, a mug of Earl Grey cooling between her palms. The morning sun stretched long across the tile floor, the air thick with the scent of rosemary from the herb bundle drying by the window. Jessica mentioned a lawsuit, she said, not quite asking. Victor gave a quiet laugh. She'll threaten. She might even draft one. But when her lawyer sees the filings I've submitted, he'll advise her to sit down before she gets laughed out of pretrial. Margaret didn't smile, not yet, but she allowed the corner of her mouth to twitch upward. She won't like that. No, she won't, Victor said, but she'll understand it. He paused, then added, You've already won. What happens next is just noise. Margaret hung up, feeling the truth settle deeper than the bones. It wasn't over, but it was settled. The foundation was hers. Everything else now was echoes. Cheryl let the call ring twice before answering. She was at her desk, sleeves rolled to the elbow, typing into the listing portal with the kind of tension that made her fingers twitch. "Jessica," she said flatly, already regretting it, "I need you to restart the listing. We'll write it under a family trust name. Margaret doesn't have to know." "Stop." The word came out sharper than Cheryl had intended. She sat back, exhaling through her nose. Jessica's voice faltered. "Excuse me? I'm not risking my license for your mess," Cheryl said. "The last time you told me it was handled, I got a phone call from a lawyer with 20 years of courtroom wins and every one of your texts printed out in a PDF. Jessica didn't respond right away. "I thought we were—" "You thought wrong," Cheryl snapped. "You wanted to strong-arm your way into a sale, but you forgot the part where you actually owned something." Jessica's silence filled the line like static. "We're done," Cheryl said, quieter now. "Don't call me again." She ended the call and closed the listing portal for good. Out in the garden, Margaret knelt near the boxwoods, pruning shears in hand. The soil was soft from last night's rain. Worms wriggled under her gloved fingers as she trimmed back the summer growth, slow and patient. It had been weeks since she'd tended the plants properly. Grief had made her frantic. Control made her still. She moved methodically down the row, finding rhythm in the snip and brush, the lift and clear. For every stem she clipped, a little more weight came off her chest. Behind her, the gate creaked. Ruth leaned on the post, holding a mason jar of lemonade like it was a cocktail. "You hear from Victor?" she asked. Margaret didn't turn around. "I did." "And?" "No lawsuit. No leg to stand on." Cheryl's backed off. Ruth grinned and took a sip. "See? Law's louder than gossip." Margaret chuckled, quietly, but genuinely. "I should embroider that on a throw pillow." "You don't embroider." "I could learn." "You'd get bored before you threaded the needle." Margaret sat back on her heels, sun warming her neck, sweat just beginning to gather under her collar. She took off her gloves, stood, and wiped her palms against her jeans. "I don't feel like a target anymore," she said softly. "You're not," Ruth said. "You're the wall now." Margaret looked toward the street. Empty today? No visitors, no vultures. Just the breeze moving through the trees and the occasional bark of a dog somewhere down the block. She could almost believe it was over. Almost. Then, her phone buzzed from the patio table. She walked over, picked it up. Blocked number. One new voicemail. She hit play. A man's voice. Calm. Corporate. "Ms. Langston, this is Eric Delaney with Camden and Weiss Capital Partners. I'm calling to follow up on your inquiry regarding third-party leasing and commercial asset repurpose. We're still interested in discussing options for the Maple Hill property portfolio under your name. We understand there's been contention. We deal with these transitions discreetly. Call me anytime." The voice clicked off. Margaret stared at the phone for a beat too long. Portfolio. They weren't just after the inn anymore. They thought she had more. And maybe, just maybe, she did. Victor's email came in just after 6 a.m. Subject line, "Urgent, fraudulent filing." Attached was a scan. A single page, grainy and misaligned, like someone had rushed it through a discount office printer. Jessica Harland had submitted a supplemental deed to the county clerk's office, claiming Margaret had agreed to joint ownership retroactively. No signature from Margaret, no notary stamp, no witnesses. But filed anyway. Victor stared at the screen for 3 seconds before snapping into motion. He dialed his courthouse contact as he pulled on his jacket. "Elaine, it's Victor. I need you to stop a recording that came through your intake box this morning. Supplemental deed, submitted by a Jessica Harland." Elaine, already at her desk with a half-eaten scone, blinked hard. I saw that name come through. Thought it was weird. It's fraudulent, Victor said bluntly. Margaret Langston is my client, sole deed holder. This was never signed. Never approved. Elaine flipped through the queue, her voice shifting from confusion to focus. Hold on. Yep, here it is. Uploaded but not processed. Looks unofficial. It is. Flag it. Mark it invalid and notify county records that this is under legal review. I'll email you the verified filings from my office, including timestamps and seal confirmations. Got it. You want me to call the registrar? Not yet, Victor said. I want this buried before it breathes. Elaine clicked her mouse. Done. Flagged as unrecordable. The systems locked her out from trying again electronically. Victor exhaled. Thank you, Elaine. He sat back, pinched the bridge of his nose. This wasn't just desperation anymore. It was criminal. Margaret stirred honey into her tea with slow, deliberate circles. The spoon clinked gently against the porcelain, once, twice, 3 times, then stilled. Victor had already texted. Handled. You'll want to sit for this one. But she didn't need to. She was already sitting. At the same kitchen table where she'd once signed her very first business loan. Alone, her hands shaking from both excitement and fear. Now they were steady, wrinkled but unshakable. The back door opened with its usual creak. Ruth stepped inside, cheeks flushed from the wind, a bag of groceries tucked under one arm and a smirk already forming. Your fan club's out of ideas. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Already? Ruth set the bag down and pulled out a copy of that morning's town bulletin. Someone had slipped a printed screenshot of Jessica's fake filing into the gossip column's submissions box. Sloppy, blurred, amateur hour. Margaret didn't look at it. She didn't need to. Ruth slid into the seat across from her and poured herself some tea. Victor says she filed without you. No notary, no witnesses. Didn't even match the original document format. She was hoping to sneak it past the clerks. She tried it in our county, Ruth said, deadpan, where Victor has probably won more court cases than the judge. Margaret finally looked up. She's running out of moves. Ruth sipped. She's not just running, she's flailing. The screen door slapped shut again, wind picking up outside. The clouds over Maple Hill were dense today. A storm was forming somewhere, but it wasn't here. Not anymore. Margaret took another sip of her tea. Calm. Still. Ruth leaned forward, voice lowering. She's digging her own grave now. Margaret nodded, slow and thoughtful. And she's using our shovels. They sat in silence for a beat, letting it hang. Then Ruth pulled something else from her bag. A thumb drive. Victor sent this to me directly. Audio file from his call with the courthouse. Proof of the filing attempt. Legal gold, if it ever comes to that. Margaret took the drive and set it gently beside her teacup. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. She's not going to stop, she said softly. No, Ruth agreed. But now, everything she does builds the case against her. Margaret looked down at the spoon still resting in her cup. She lifted it, stirred again. Just once. The phone buzzed on the counter behind her. Margaret stood, walked over, and glanced at the screen. Unknown caller again. She let it ring. When the voicemail icon blinked, she played it. A clipped voice. Not Jessica. Not Kyle. Someone colder. Ms. Langston, this is Rachel Green from Fairmont Legal Group. I represent a party interested in contesting your claim to the Maple Hill property. We'll be delivering correspondence shortly. If you wish to resolve this amicably, I suggest responding immediately. The message ended. Margaret didn't move for a long moment. Then she turned off the phone and walked to the drawer where she kept her oldest, sharpest fountain pen. The moving truck pulled up just after noon. Not a rental. Professional. Clean white sides. Liftgate humming like a threat. Margaret heard it from the kitchen and didn't bother to move. She finished pouring the tea. Peppermint this time. No honey, and sat back down at the table. Outside, gravel crunched. Footsteps thudded. A box slammed onto the porch. Then came the knock. Loud. 3 times. Familiar rhythm. She opened the door slowly, one hand behind the frame, the other holding a thick manila envelope. Jessica stood on the steps, one foot already over the threshold, a pair of designer sunglasses perched like armor. Behind her, Kyle hauled another box from the truck, sweat already darkening the collar of his shirt. "We're moving in," Jessica said. Margaret didn't step back. "I don't think so." Jessica's smile was thin. "You can't stop us." Margaret lifted the envelope and pulled out a sheet. The deed. Courthouse seal bright in the sunlight. "I already did." Kyle stomped up the porch. "We're family. That house is ours too." "You're not on the deed," Margaret said simply. "Neither of you. And your name doesn't make this your address." Jessica's face flushed deep pink. "We have equity. History. Frank would never." "Frank is gone," Margaret cut in. "And I didn't bury him with the keys." Across the street, the first porch door opened. Mrs. Linton again. No watering can this time. Just arms folded, eyes locked on the scene. 2 more neighbors followed. A curtain twitched next door. The small-town grapevine was already buzzing. Jessica noticed. She turned and called toward the truck, waving her hand sharply. "Start bringing the rest. I don't care if she's waving a piece of paper, it's a bluff." Kyle hesitated. Margaret didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. "Touch 1 more box," she said quietly, "and I'll consider it trespassing." Kyle froze. The screen door banged open again. Ruth stood at the bottom of the porch steps, camera already filming. "I'd listen to her if I were you," Ruth called up. "Or I'll make sure your next photo op's a mugshot." Jessica whirled. "Are you serious?" "Deadly," Ruth replied. Jessica turned back to Margaret. "You're playing dirty now." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "You climbed into the dirt first. I just stopped cleaning it up." The truck engine shut off. Kyle stood stiff, fists clenched. "You have no idea what you've started." "Oh, I do," Margaret said. "You just thought I wouldn't finish it." The sound of sirens cut through the afternoon heat, low and approaching. Jessica's face twisted. "You called the police?" "No," Margaret said. "A neighbor must have." 2 squad cars rolled up quietly, not in a rush, not surprised. Officer Myers stepped out first, notebook in hand. He'd been stationed in Maple Hill since '03. He knew every last person on that street, including who did and didn't belong. "Got a report of attempted forced entry," he said calmly, walking toward the porch. "Afternoon, Ms. Langston." "Afternoon," she said, handing him the envelope. Myers flipped it open, scanned, nodded. "This the updated deed?" "Filed last month, verified by Victor Carmichael." Kyle stepped forward. "We're not forcing anything. We're family." Myers raised a brow. "You got paperwork to support that, Mr. Harland?" Jessica thrust a folded page toward him. "Right here." He unfolded it, squinted, turned it over. "This isn't notarized. No seal, no stamp. This is a typed Word doc." "It's a draft," she snapped. Myers handed it back. "Then it's nothing." Jessica's voice cracked. "We have a right." Myers turned to her, calm but firm. "No. You had a plan. And it didn't involve doing it legally." Kyle swore under his breath. "Unbelievable." Myers turned to Margaret. "Want them formally trespassed?" Margaret thought for a long moment, then shook her head. "Not yet." Myers gave her a long look, then nodded once. "Understood. But they need to leave. Now." Jessica looked like she might break something. Kyle kicked the side of the truck. Margaret didn't flinch. As they loaded the boxes back into the van, Ruth climbed the porch and leaned close. That was the last nail, wasn't it? Margaret took a sip of tea, still warm. No, she said. She turned to watch the truck pull away. The last nail's coming in writing. The pen moved slowly, but her hand didn't tremble. Margaret sat across from the estate attorney in a quiet office in Sedona, the red rock skyline glowing through the panoramic windows behind him. No courthouse, no spectators. Just clean paper, the hum of air conditioning, and final decisions. Section 3, the attorney said, turning the page. This is where we list beneficiaries. Any assets not already protected by the trust will pass according to this section. Margaret didn't hesitate. Strike Jessica Harland. Strike Kyle Whitmore. He didn't even blink, just drew a line through the names and adjusted the paragraph formatting. And instead, Margaret reached into her tote and pulled out a folded note, her own handwriting, block letters, no flourishes. Emma Langston, she said, and the Maple Hill Literacy Endowment. The attorney glanced up. The local nonprofit? She reads to children at the library every Friday, Margaret said softly. I want her to have what matters. He nodded. Do you want to add a clause regarding the inn? No clause, she said. It stays exactly as it is. Protected, untouchable. If Emma decides to run it, good. If not, it stays in the trust, held by the foundation. He clicked his pen once. Understood. Across the room, Ruth leaned against the bookshelf with a cup of lemon water, eyebrows raised. Want me to witness this train finally leaving the station? You're already listed, Margaret replied. Ruth came over, took the pen when offered, and signed with a flourish. Been waiting 20 years to put my name on something that makes them squirm. The attorney chuckled. Margaret leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking beneath her. She let the moment breathe. The walls felt still, her chest lighter. It wasn't rage anymore, or strategy. It was finality. The legacy she'd built wasn't for people who treated it like a trophy. She stood smoothing her blouse. I'd like the original mailed certified, she said, and copies kept in both safe deposit boxes. We'll handle it, the attorney replied. They walked out into the Arizona sun, the heat wrapping around her shoulders like a weight she no longer minded carrying. Emma was waiting on the steps. Grandma, she said, arms already open. Margaret stepped into the hug and let it linger. The girl smelled like sunscreen and sugar, youth and promise, the opposite of the rot she'd scrubbed from her life. Emma pulled back, eyes shining. You really did it, didn't you? Margaret brushed a strand of hair from her granddaughter's cheek. I did. Are you okay? Margaret looked out at the open sky, the stretch of desert that offered no room for shadows to hide. I'm better than okay, she said. They walked to the car slowly. No rush now. Not anymore. Ruth climbed into the driver's seat. You know, she said over her shoulder, when this hits probate, Jessica's head's going to explode. Probate won't be for a long time, Margaret replied. That's the plan. Emma giggled. Margaret slid into the back seat and exhaled. Let them scramble. Let them hear from the executor, not her. Let them find out they'd been erased, in ink, in law, and in memory. But as Ruth started the car, Margaret's phone buzzed again. She pulled it from her purse without urgency. No caller ID, just a new text. You may have shut the door, but you forgot the window. No name. No context. Just that. Margaret stared at the screen. The desert rolled by outside. Ruth caught her glance in the rearview. Something wrong? Margaret's jaw tightened. Not yet. She powered off the phone, then turned to Emma. Do you remember how to use the safe? Emma nodded. Left 30. Right 25. Left 5. Pull hard. Margaret smiled. Good. She looked out the window again, eyes narrowing against the sun. Because some things didn't stay buried. Some things learned to crawl. The first sign was a for sale sign. Not in Margaret's yard. This one was crooked, sun-faded, and planted at an awkward angle in front of Jessica and Kyle's McCrafted monstrosity at the edge of town. No announcement, no ribbon-cut photo. Just a whisper of failure disguised as a quiet listing. Within days, the whispers weren't quiet anymore. They missed 3 payments. He leveraged it all on the inn, the one he never owned. She maxed out the equity line, furnishing a guest house no one stayed in. The bank notices followed. Thin white envelopes slipped under the door. Then the knock. Then the paper taped to the glass like a death certificate. Margaret didn't go near it. She didn't need to. Maple Hill was small and loud. At the diner, Ruth raised her coffee like it was champagne. To dessert justice, she said, smirking. Best served cold and garnished with foreclosure. Margaret didn't toast. She stirred her tea slowly. A flicker of something, regret maybe, crossed her face, but it never settled. They thought they were entitled to everything, Ruth added. Turns out they weren't even entitled to the flooring under their feet. Emma, sitting beside her grandmother with a paperback tucked under one arm, looked out the diner window. Across the square, Kyle's truck sat crooked in front of the post office, the back bed piled with boxes. Emma shook her head. He still thinks someone's going to bail them out. Margaret didn't respond. She watched a bee circle the sugar dispenser. I remember when they used to call me forgettable, she murmured. Now they can't seem to forget me. Ruth leaned in. Victor sent something. She slid her phone across the table. Margaret glanced down at the screen. Subject: foreclosure filed. Harland Whitmore residence attached. Legal filing. Stamp dated and signed. Victor's note was short. They defaulted. House will be auctioned in 45 days unless paid in full. Which it won't be. Margaret exhaled, slow and deep. She hadn't waited for this. Hadn't chased it. But now that it was here, it felt like the last tile falling off a crumbling roof. Jessica stood in her half-packed living room, surrounded by boxes and dust. The couch had already been sold. The art was gone. Kyle paced the hallway, phone to his ear, voice low and panicked. There's still time, she muttered. Someone will call back. We can refinance. They can't just... They can, Kyle snapped. Because you didn't tell me the LLC was never filed. You told me the inn was our backup plan. Jessica's voice broke. It was supposed to be. I thought she'd fold. I thought she'd... Kyle threw the phone against the wall. It cracked. The silence afterward was worse. Outside, a neighbor walked by slowly, eyes darting toward the house. Jessica moved to close the curtain. Too late. The same neighbor crossed the street and whispered something to a second one. Then a third. They didn't wave. They didn't pretend not to see. In the car that evening, Emma rode shotgun as Margaret drove home. Do you think they'll leave town? Emma asked. Margaret didn't answer right away. The road unspooled in front of them, long and gold beneath the evening sun. They'll try, she said at last. But desperation has a way of sticking to your shoes. They passed the corner where Jessica once posed for town parade photos, beaming with borrowed authority. Now that bench sat empty. The banner that once bore her name had been replaced with one for the fall festival. No sponsors listed, no Harlands in sight. Back at the inn, Margaret unlocked the front door with the ease of someone who knew it was hers, not because a document said so, but because every corner had been earned, not inherited. She flipped the porch light on. One bulb flickered, then steadied. She didn't fix it. Not yet. Let it hum. Let it hold. As she turned toward the staircase, her phone buzzed. A number she hadn't saved. The preview showed the first line of a text. "This isn't over. Not even close." She locked the screen, then walked upstairs, and bolted the door behind her. The courthouse atrium smelled like disinfectant and old paper. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as folding chairs scraped against dull tile. A modest crowd had formed, contractors with boots still caked in drywall dust, out-of-town speculators in pressed chinos, and one man in a golf hat who hadn't looked up from his phone once. Margaret sat 2 rows from the front, crisp bitter card in her lap, pale blue. Number 83. Her reading glasses perched low on her nose, a leather portfolio resting neatly on the seat beside her. She didn't shift, didn't check her watch. Just watched the door. When Jessica entered, it wasn't dramatic, but it was loud. In that peculiar way failure makes sound without speaking. Her heels hit the tile too fast, too sharp, like they were trying to outrun the shame. Kyle followed, sweat already gathering under his collar. He scanned the room like he expected someone to save them. No one waved. Then Jessica saw Margaret. She froze, a half step too short. Kyle noticed a beat later. "Shit," he muttered, low and angry. Margaret didn't move. She didn't smile. She simply adjusted her glasses and flipped open her portfolio. One tabbed page, bank-certified check, already countersigned. Behind her, 2 chairs squeaked. Jessica and Kyle sat. They were close enough to smell the anxiety in Kyle's aftershave. The auctioneer stepped up to the podium, a heavy-set man with a navy windbreaker and a voice like gravel. "Property, Gaksha 4217, Harland House Whitmore Residence, as described in Docket Record 2025, Sayedin 84. Minimum opening bid, $318,000. He cleared his throat and looked out. "We have several registered parties. Shall we begin?" A hand in the back rose. "Contractor." Tight haircut. Number 41. 318. Another hand. "Phone guy." 325. Margaret waited. Calm. Still. One fingertip resting on the edge of her bidder card. Jessica leaned toward Kyle, whispering furiously. Kyle stood halfway up and hissed in her ear. "Why is she here? She already won everything." Jessica didn't answer. Her face was pale, lips thin to the edge of tears. The contractor bid again. 335. Margaret raised her card. 340. The room shifted. A glance here. A mutter there. Jessica flinched like she'd been slapped. Kyle's hands balled into fists. Margaret didn't even look back. The phone guy countered. 350. Margaret raised her card again. 360. The auctioneer nodded. 360, bidder 83. Contractor hesitated. Phone guy turned in his seat. Jessica whispered harshly, "She's bluffing. She's just here to spook the others." Kyle's jaw clenched. "She doesn't bluff." The room went still. No one else raised their card. The auctioneer looked around, hand hovering. "Last call, 360 to bidder 83. Going once." Jessica stood. "Wait." Everyone turned. Even the auctioneer paused. Jessica's voice faltered. There's an appeal pending. Legal complications? The sale shouldn't..." "No motion to stay was filed," the auctioneer said. "Per court order, the sale proceeds." He nodded again. "Going twice." Kyle grabbed Jessica's arm. "Sit down." "Sold." The gavel hit the podium. Margaret didn't flinch. A clerk approached with paperwork. She handed over the check, signed one page, then rose. Calm, composed, deliberate. Jessica stared at her like a ghost had walked through the door and taken the last light with it. "You didn't need the house," Jessica said bitterly. "No," Margaret replied, "but I needed the silence." She turned toward the exit, never rushed, never rattled. Behind her, the buzz of whispers started again. Kyle sat down hard, like his bones couldn't carry it anymore. Jessica didn't move. Outside, the wind had picked up. Leaves scraped across the sidewalk like tiny regrets. Margaret stepped onto the courthouse steps and paused. Victor was waiting at the bottom, leaning against a rental sedan. He didn't wave, just nodded. "It's yours," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "The house," she clarified. "Put it in the foundation portfolio. Have Naomi close escrow under the trust's shell. No fanfare." Victor gave a half smile. "You always play the long game." "I only play games I've already won." As she stepped off the curb, her phone buzzed. A message. No name. "You can keep the walls. We already took what matters." She stared at it, read it twice, then deleted it. Victor opened the car door for her. "Where to now?" Margaret looked up at the fading courthouse behind them, then out toward the far edge of town where the real rebuilding had already begun. "Home," she said. "The one that's never for sale." And she shut the door behind her. The ink dried in silence. Margaret handed the pen back to the escrow agent, her signature etched cleanly at the bottom of the transfer form. The purchase was complete. Clear title, private trust, full cash transaction. No lender, no questions. The deed that once belonged to Kyle and Jessica, arrogantly, carelessly, was now hers. Not for spite, for the principle of permanence. The agent slid the file into a padded envelope, sealed it, and offered a courteous smile. "Congratulations, Ms. Langston." Margaret nodded once, then stood, smoothing the front of her jacket. When she turned, she found them already waiting. Jessica and Kyle stood just inside the lobby's glass doors, not speaking, not blinking. Jessica's mouth was slightly parted, as if she'd been about to speak, and lost the sentence mid-thought. Kyle looked hollowed out, like someone had opened a trapdoor inside his chest and let the certainty drain out. Margaret didn't stop. She walked past them with the envelope tucked beneath her arm like a closing gift, a thank you note to herself for surviving them. Jessica's voice came thin and brittle behind her. "You bought it?" Margaret paused just outside the door, turned slightly. "I kept it," she said. "You were the ones who sold it." Then she stepped into the bright morning, letting the automatic doors slide shut behind her. Across the street, Emma stood by the car, beaming. "You really did it," she whispered, practically bouncing on her toes. Margaret nodded, expression unreadable. "The paperwork's done." Emma reached for the envelope, but Margaret pulled it gently back. "Not yet," she said. "You'll hold it when you're ready for what it means." Emma swallowed her excitement and stood taller. Ruth emerged from the driver's side, sunglasses tilted down her nose. "Well," she said, spreading her arms wide, "if this were a movie, this is where we'd cue the music and slow walk past the wreckage." Margaret chuckled softly. "I'm not here for wreckage," she replied. "Just the quiet after." Ruth didn't say anything else. She simply pulled Margaret into a tight, grounding hug, the kind that smelled like hand lotion and defiance. Over Ruth's shoulder, Margaret caught movement. The glass doors opened again. Jessica and Kyle stepped outside. No fanfare, no shouts, no demands, just silence. Kyle kept his hands in his pockets. Jessica's heels clicked against the concrete, loud in the empty air. They didn't follow, didn't wave, just stood there, statues of a life misplayed. For the first time, the weight wasn't on Margaret. It was on them. Back in Maple Hill, the news traveled like it always did, through porches, grocery aisles, and soft-voiced speculation. She bought their house outright. With what? I thought she was... Didn't you hear? She never left. They were the ones living on borrowed time. Neighbors who once offered sympathy now offered space, deference, small nods instead of questions. She wasn't a mystery anymore. She was a story that ended differently than they'd assumed. Respect began replacing pity, and nobody whispered the word widow anymore. Just Margaret, like that was enough. That afternoon, Emma followed her grandmother through the front door of the house that wasn't theirs, until it was. The Harland Whitmore house, now Langston owned, held in trust, transferred with no debt and no fight. The air inside still smelled faintly of someone else's soap and the stale bitterness of resentment. But that would fade. Margaret opened the windows. Light flooded in. Emma stepped into the kitchen and grinned. "Can we repaint the backsplash?" Margaret nodded. "Whatever you want. It's ours now." She placed the deed on the table, right where the past had once tried to anchor her. Then she set her hand on it, flat and firm, like pressing a memory into place. A bird chirped outside. Ruth arrived with lemon bars and paint swatches, the kitchen filled with light and color and new plans. The air was different now, not reclaimed, redefined. Later, as the sun dipped behind the ridge and the breeze carried the scent of sage through the open door, Margaret stepped out onto the front porch. No crowds, no glares, just a few neighbors out walking dogs. One of them, Mrs. Linton, paused, lifted a hand, and nodded once. Margaret nodded back. Ruth leaned against the railing, sipping a glass of iced tea. "You know," she said softly, "I think you scared them more with silence than any lawsuit ever could." Margaret looked over the railing, then at the porch under her feet. She didn't say anything right away. She didn't have to. Because the house stood. Because the name on the deed was hers. Because not every home is built with wooden nails. Some are built with boundaries. With earned quiet. With survival no one clapped for, but everyone noticed. And as the last rays of light stretched long over the lawn, Margaret stepped back inside, the door clicking gently behind her. They whispered my end. But I walked in with cash, and silence followed me home.